On the morning of November 14th, 1902, a freight train pulling into the Duluth depot carried an unexpected passenger. Thomas Garrett Halloway, 41 years of age, was found in an empty boxcar by railway workers, seated upright on the floor with his back against the wall, staring at nothing in particular. He wore boots caked in mud of an unusual reddish color. His coat was torn at the shoulder. When asked where he had come from, he did not answer. The police were summoned. Halloway was identified through papers in his jacket pocket, a timber company work permit, and a letter from his wife, dated 3 months prior. He was from Cloquet, Minnesota, approximately 30 miles southwest. He had been reported missing along with 6 other men on August 22, 1902, when a logging crew failed to return from a survey expedition into the Boundary Waters region near the Canadian border. The other 6 men were never found. Halloway was examined by Dr. Philip Morehouse at St. Mary's Hospital. The physician's notes, preserved in the county medical archive, describe a man in generally sound physical condition despite obvious weight loss. No serious injuries, no fever, no sign of frostbite or significant malnutrition. Patient is alert and responsive to direct commands, Dr. Morehouse wrote, but offers no verbal communication, eye contact minimal, does not appear to suffer from confusion or delirium, psychological shock suspected. When questioned by Sheriff Amos Trudeau, Halloway looked at him for a long time. Then he shook his head once, slowly, and turned away. He would not speak of what happened in those 84 days. Not to the sheriff, not to the timber company investigators, not to the families of the missing men who came to him, weeping, demanding to know where their husbands and sons had gone. He sat in silence and looked at his hands. The newspapers called him the man who came back. Within 2 weeks, public sentiment shifted from sympathy to suspicion. The Duluth Herald ran the headline, "Sole Survivor Refuses to Explain Disappearance of 6." Editorials questioned his character. Anonymous letters were sent to the police suggesting he be arrested. A Presbyterian minister in Cloquet delivered a sermon titled, "The Weight of Unspoken Sin." Halloway's wife, Margaret, collected him from the hospital on November 19th. They returned to their small house on the edge of town. Neighbors reported seeing her lead him by the arm, as if he were blind. He never worked for the timber company again. In the spring of 1903, Margaret Halloway gave a single interview to a reporter from the Minneapolis Journal. She spoke carefully, choosing each word with precision. "My husband is not a cruel man," she said. "He is not hiding something out of malice. He is protecting us from something. I do not ask him what it was. I trust that he has good reason." The journalist pressed her. What did she mean by protecting? Margaret looked out the window of her home. "There are things that should not be repeated," she said. "Things that once spoken cannot be unheard." The interview was published, but largely ignored. By then, public interest had moved on to other tragedies. Thomas Halloway lived another 27 years. He worked odd jobs, carpentry, dock labor, deliveries. He avoided large groups. In 1911, his wife died of pneumonia. He did not remarry. His neighbors described him as polite but remote, a man who seemed always to be listening for something just beyond the range of hearing. In September 1929, Halloway suffered a stroke and was admitted to St. Luke's Hospital in Duluth. A young nurse named Evelyn Marsh attended him in his final days. Years later, in a letter to a historian researching the case, she recalled that Halloway had tried to speak only once, on the night before he died. She had been adjusting his pillow when his hand suddenly gripped her wrist, his eyes clouded with age and illness, focused on her face. His lips moved. She leaned close. "He said one word," Marsh wrote. "It sounded like quiet, or maybe keep quiet. I'm not certain." Then he closed his eyes and let go. He passed the next morning. Thomas Halloway was buried in Cloquet Cemetery beside his wife. The grave marker lists only his name and the years of his life. There is no epitaph. The question has never been answered. What happened during those 84 days? And why, in all the years that followed, did he choose silence over explanation, dignity, or peace? This is an attempt to reconstruct not what he saw, but what he refused to say. In the summer of 1902, the timber industry in northern Minnesota was at the height of its expansion. White pine forests stretched for hundreds of miles, and logging companies competed fiercely for territorial access. The Northwoods Timber Corporation, based out of Virginia, Minnesota, employed over 300 men across a dozen camps. Thomas Halloway had worked for Northwoods for 9 years, first as a sawyer, then as a crew foreman. He was known as reliable, not particularly friendly but fair. His wife Margaret had taught school before their marriage. They had no children. By all accounts, their life was modest and stable. The expedition into the Boundary Waters was authorized on August 15, 1902, by company surveyor Martin Endicott. The objective was to assess timber quality and accessibility along the network of lakes and rivers near the Canadian border. The area was remote, difficult to navigate, and largely unmapped. It was expected to take 2 weeks. 7 men were selected. Thomas Halloway, age 41, foreman. Jacob Lindstrom, age 36, timber grader. Owen Fisk, age 28, surveyor's assistant. Samuel Dutch Koopman, age 44, camp cook and logistics. Henry Voss, age 33, axeman. Cyrus Albright, age 51, company clerk and recorder. And Peter Mulvaney, age 19, hired hand. The roster was found in the Northwoods Company ledger, along with notations on supplies and expected routes. Each man had been paid a week's wages in advance. Each had signed a waiver acknowledging the risks of remote travel. Interviews conducted after the disappearance reveal small, ordinary details, fragments of lives before they vanished. Jacob Lindstrom had a wife, Nora, and 2 daughters, ages 7 and 9. He had been saving money to buy farmland near Brainerd. Nora later told investigators that Jacob had seemed excited about the expedition. He wanted to see the lakes, she said. He always talked about how quiet it must be up there. Owen Fisk was engaged to a woman named Clara Holt. They planned to marry in the fall. Clara's testimony is brief. Owen kissed me goodbye on the morning of August 16th. He said he'd bring me back a stone from the northern shore, something smooth and white. She never saw him again. Henry Voss was a German immigrant, unmarried, known for his strength and his temper. His boarding house landlord recalled that Voss had gotten into a fistfight 2 days before the departure, but had shaken hands with the other man afterward. Henry wasn't mean, the landlord said, just proud. Samuel Koopman had worked as a cook in logging camps for 15 years. He had a reputation for good humor and terrible card playing. A fellow worker remembered him joking that he was looking forward to the trip because it's the only job where nobody complains about my cooking. Cyrus Albright was the oldest of the group. He had poor eyesight and chronic back pain. Several men questioned why he had been included. Albright himself had written to his brother in Illinois a week before the expedition. I am too old for this kind of work, but the company insists I go to keep records. I will manage. Peter Mulvaney was the youngest. He had been hired only 3 weeks prior. His father, a dock worker in Superior, Wisconsin, said Peter was eager to prove himself. He had no experience in the wilderness. Halloway was the only one who had been that far north before. In 1897, he had been part of a smaller survey crew that had traveled into similar territory. That trip had gone smoothly. Halloway had returned on schedule with detailed notes and maps. The night before the 1902 departure, the 7 men gathered at a boarding house in Ely, Minnesota, the last settlement before the wilderness. The owner, a woman named Judith Crane, later testified that the men had been in good spirits. They ate a large meal. Halloway sat at the head of the table and went over maps with Fisk and Albright. Koopman told jokes. Lindstrom wrote a letter to his wife by lamplight. They were calm, Crane said. There was no sense of danger. They seemed like men who had done this sort of thing 100 times. Only one moment gave her pause. Late in the evening, Halloway had stepped outside to smoke. Crane had gone out to retrieve firewood and found him standing alone in the yard, looking toward the tree line. She asked if everything was all right. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It's a long way in." Crane did not think much of it at the time. The men departed at dawn on August 16th. They traveled by canoe, carrying 2 weeks of provisions. The plan was to follow a chain of lakes north, reach a designated survey point, and return by the same route. They were last seen by a trapper named Emil Toivonen on August 18th. Toivonen encountered them near Knife Lake, approximately 40 miles from Ely. He shared coffee with them briefly. In his statement to investigators, he said the group seemed well organized and well supplied. Halloway was in charge, Toivonen said. The others followed his lead. No arguments, no trouble. They were headed deeper in. Toivonen asked if they were concerned about weather. Halloway said they had enough time. That was the last confirmed sighting. Reconstructing what happened after August 18th requires inference, guesswork, and the careful reading of silences. The Boundary Waters region is a labyrinth of lakes, rivers, bogs, and dense forest. Navigation depends on maps, compass work, and experience. Weather can shift rapidly. Even in summer, temperatures drop sharply at night. The isolation is profound. Travelers can go days without encountering another human being. When the men failed to return by September 1st, the timber company sent out a search party. Led by veteran woodsman Anders Johansson, the team retraced the planned route. They found no sign of the missing crew until September 9th, when they located the expedition's first campsite near Knife Lake. Johansson's report, preserved in company records, describes what they found. Campfire circle intact. Food supplies partially consumed, left in proper storage. 2 canoes pulled ashore and overturned, standard practice. No sign of struggle or disturbance. Camp appeared abandoned in orderly fashion. The search team continued north. Over the following 10 days, they located 3 more campsites, each similar to the first. Organized, methodical, no indication of panic or disaster. Then the trail ended. On September 17th, Johansson's team reached a narrow channel between 2 unnamed lakes. There, they found one of the expedition's canoes, partially submerged in shallow water. It had not capsized. It had been deliberately sunk, weighted down with stones. No other canoes were found, no bodies, no equipment, no trace of the 6 missing men. Johansson wrote, "It is as though they simply chose to stop existing." The search was called off on September 24th. The company issued a statement declaring the men presumed dead, likely due to drowning or exposure. Families were notified. The case was officially closed. Thomas Halloway reappeared 7 weeks later. How he traveled from the Boundary Waters to Duluth, a distance of more than 100 miles, was never explained. He had no canoe, no map, no provisions when he was found. The mud on his boots was tested by a university geologist at the request of the sheriff's department. It was identified as clay-rich sediment consistent with lake shores in the Boundary Waters region, but the exact location could not be determined. Halloway's clothing told investigators almost nothing. His coat and trousers showed wear consistent with prolonged outdoor exposure, but no bloodstains, no burns, no tears that suggested violence. His boots were worn down at the heels, indicating significant walking. When pressed by Sheriff Trudeau, Halloway was asked directly, "Did the others die?" Halloway looked at him. He did not nod. He did not shake his head. He simply stared until Trudeau looked away. Theories proliferated. Some believed the men had drowned in a sudden storm, and Halloway had been the sole survivor by chance. But no bodies surfaced. No wreckage was found. Others speculated that the group had become lost, succumbed to starvation or hypothermia, and Halloway had been the last to remain conscious, leaving the others behind. But the timeline did not support this. 84 days was far too long to survive without significant resources. Darker theories emerged. Newspapers hinted at foul play. Had Halloway murdered the others? Was there a dispute over money or territory or something else? Had he gone mad? The lack of physical evidence made prosecution impossible, but suspicion lingered. A retired Pinkerton detective named Howard Finch took an interest in the case. In a series of articles published in 1904, Finch argued that Halloway's silence was not the behavior of a guilty man. A murderer, Finch wrote, would either confess or construct a lie. Halloway does neither. His silence is deliberate and unyielding. This suggests not guilt, but fear. Fear of what? Finch interviewed Margaret Halloway. She refused to discuss her husband's mental state, but made one observation that Finch found significant. "He does not have nightmares," Margaret said. "I thought he would, but he sleeps soundly. It is when he is awake that he seems watchful." Finch also spoke with Dr. Morehouse, the physician who had examined Halloway upon his return. Morehouse admitted that he had been puzzled by the absence of trauma symptoms. "I have treated men who survived shipwrecks, industrial accidents, acts of violence," Morehouse said. "They exhibit predictable patterns, startle responses, emotional volatility, intrusive memories. Halloway exhibited none of these. He was calm, almost unnaturally so. It was as if he had made a decision and was simply abiding by it." In October 1903, a hunter named Robert Sills reported finding what he believed to be human remains near the Canadian border, roughly 60 miles north of where the search had ended. A second search team was dispatched. They found animal bones, not human. The boundary waters yielded no answers. The missing men stayed missing, and Thomas Halloway stayed silent. The silence became its own kind of presence in Cloquet. Neighbors avoided Halloway. Shopkeepers served him quickly without conversation. Children dared each other to walk past his house after dark. Margaret Halloway bore the weight of it with quiet dignity. She continued to attend church, though she sat alone. She kept the house tidy. She did not defend her husband publicly, but she did not abandon him either. In 1904, Nora Lindstrom, widow of Jacob Lindstrom, came to the Halloway home. She knocked on the door. Margaret answered. According to Margaret's later account, Nora did not ask to speak with Thomas. She simply stood on the porch and said, "I need to know if my husband suffered." Margaret called Thomas to the door. He came. He stood in the doorway and looked at Nora Lindstrom for a long time. Nora asked again, her voice breaking, "Did he suffer?" Halloway's expression did not change. Then, very slowly, he shook his head. Nora began to cry. "Is he dead?" Halloway nodded. Nora wiped her eyes. "Can you tell me where?" Halloway closed his eyes. He did not answer. After a moment, he stepped back and shut the door. Margaret later said that Nora stood on the porch for several minutes before leaving. She never returned. The incident was repeated in variations over the years. Families of the missing men sought Halloway out. Some pleaded, some accused, some offered money. A few brought priests or ministers, hoping spiritual authority might compel him to speak. Halloway's response was always the same: silence. In 1907, the father of Peter Mulvaney, the youngest member of the expedition, confronted Halloway outside a hardware store in Duluth. Witnesses reported that the old man grabbed Halloway by the collar and shouted, "My son was 19 years old. You owe me the truth." Halloway did not resist. He stood still and let the man shake him. Then he said quietly, "I'm sorry." It was one of the few times he spoke about the incident at all. The elder Mulvaney released him and walked away, weeping. By 1910, the story had faded from public memory. The timber company had moved on. The families, unable to obtain closure, had either relocated or learned to live with uncertainty. Halloway himself had become a ghost in his own life, present but unnoticed, moving through the world without leaving a mark. He found work where he could. A carpenter in Virginia, Minnesota, hired him for several months in 1911. The carpenter later told a journalist, "Tom was a good worker. Didn't talk much, but his hands were steady. Never saw him make a mistake, but there was something about him. You didn't want to ask questions." After Margaret's death in 1911, Halloway lived alone. Census records from 1920 list him as a widower, employed intermittently as a laborer. He rented a small room above a grocer's shop in Duluth. The grocer's daughter, Helen Strand, recalled him as polite and sad. "He would come downstairs to buy bread and coffee," she said. "Always paid exact change. Never stayed to chat. Once I asked him if he had family. He said no, but the way he said it wasn't like he was alone. It was like he was keeping watch over something." In 1918, during the height of the influenza pandemic, Halloway volunteered at a makeshift hospital in Duluth. Nurses reported that he was tireless, unflinching in the face of death. He carried bodies. He comforted the dying. He worked without complaint. One nurse, Alice Brennan, wrote in her diary, "There is a man here named Thomas who does not seem afraid of death. I asked him why. He said, 'I've already seen it.' I did not understand what he meant." The years wore on. Halloway aged. He developed arthritis in his hands. His hearing grew poor. He walked with a slight limp. Neighbors who had once shunned him now regarded him with a kind of distant pity. In 1927, a young journalist named Raymond Cole attempted to interview Halloway for a piece on Minnesota's Forgotten Mysteries. Cole tracked him down to a boarding house on Superior Street. He knocked. Halloway answered. Cole introduced himself and explained his purpose. Halloway listened without expression. "Mr. Halloway," Cole said, "it's been 25 years. Don't you think the families deserve to know?" Halloway looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "No." "Why not?" "Because they're better off not knowing," Cole pressed. "Better off how?" Halloway stepped back and began to close the door. Cole put his hand out to stop it. "What happened to those men?" Cole demanded. Halloway's face changed, just slightly, just for a moment. It was, Cole later wrote, the look of a man who has carried something so heavy for so long that he has forgotten what it feels like to set it down. "They're gone," Halloway said. "That's all you need to write." He shut the door. Cole published a short article. It went unnoticed. In September 1929, Halloway collapsed on the street near the docks. A passerby called for help. He was taken to St. Luke's Hospital, where he was diagnosed with a stroke. The right side of his body was partially paralyzed. He could not walk. His speech was slurred and effortful. He was placed in a ward for terminal patients. Nurse Evelyn Marsh attended him. In her letter to the historian, written in 1956, she described her final interaction with him in detail. "It was late. Most of the patients were asleep. I was checking his vitals when I noticed his eyes were open. He was staring at the ceiling. I asked if he was in pain. He shook his head. Then he reached out, his left hand, the one that still worked, and took hold of my wrist. His grip was weak but insistent. I leaned down. He was trying to speak. His voice was barely a whisper. I put my ear close to his mouth. He said something that sounded like quiet or stay quiet. I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer. His hand went slack. He closed his eyes. He died the next morning at 6:15 a.m. Thomas Garrett Halloway was buried on September 28, 1929. 4 people attended the funeral: the minister, the gravedigger, and 2 elderly neighbors who had known Margaret. No family came. The missing men had no graves to lie beside. The silence he had kept for 27 years was finally complete. What follows is not an answer. It is an interpretation, offered cautiously and with full awareness of its limitations. Thomas Halloway did not refuse to speak because he was guilty. The evidence does not support that conclusion. If he had killed 6 men out of rage, greed, or madness, there would have been signs: blood on his clothing, defensive wounds, psychological collapse. None of these were present. Dr. Knight, Morehouse's examination was thorough. Halloway was calm, functional. He lived for nearly 3 decades without exhibiting the behaviors typical of murderers who escape justice, nor did he refuse to speak because he did not remember. Amnesia, trauma-induced or otherwise, presents differently. Halloway's silence was not confusion. It was choice. When Nora Lindstrom asked if her husband had suffered, Halloway shook his head. When she asked if he was dead, Halloway nodded. These were deliberate, coherent responses. He knew what had happened. He simply would not describe it. The journalist Raymond Cole wrote in 1927 that Halloway had said the families were better off not knowing. This is the key phrase. It suggests that whatever Halloway witnessed was not merely tragic, but corrosive, something that would harm those who heard it. What could that be? Not violence. Families of murder victims seek justice, but they can process the truth of violence. They bury their dead and move forward. Halloway's refusal to speak denied them even that. Not accident. If the men had drowned or fallen or been killed by wildlife, there would be no reason to withhold the details. Grief is painful, but it is manageable. Silence only deepens it. The logical conclusion, one hesitates to say it plainly, is that the truth was unbearable, not because of what happened, but because of what it implied. Consider the details. The campsites were orderly. The men had not fled in panic. They had not been attacked. They had simply stopped, and then they were gone. The canoe was deliberately sunk. Someone weighted it with stones. That requires intention, calm, purposeful action. Halloway survived for 84 days and walked more than 100 miles without provisions. How? What sustained him? And why, during all that time, did he not go back? Why did he not attempt to guide rescuers to the site? Because he could not, or would not, or both. Historian Evelyn Turner, writing in 1963 in the Northern Review, proposed what she called the silence theory. She argued that Halloway's refusal to speak was an act of protection, not for himself, but for others. Turner wrote, "Halloway was not hiding guilt. He was hiding knowledge. Whatever he and the other men encountered in the wilderness, whether it was a natural phenomenon, a human act, or something else, it was something that, once articulated, could not be forgotten." Halloway understood that some truths do not liberate. They imprison. His silence was an act of mercy. Turner's theory was dismissed by some as overly speculative, but it remains the most coherent explanation for Halloway's behavior. If he believed that speaking would endanger others, psychologically, spiritually, or otherwise, then silence becomes not evasion, but responsibility. One final piece of evidence supports this interpretation. In 1952, a forest ranger named Carl Nieberg was conducting a survey near the Canadian border. He came across an old campsite, overgrown and barely visible. Half buried in the soil, he found a rusted cooking pot and a rotted canvas pack. Inside the pack was a leather journal, water-damaged and mostly illegible. Nieberg turned the journal over to the Minnesota Historical Society. Archivists were able to partially restore it. The handwriting was identified as belonging to Cyrus Albright, the company clerk who had disappeared with the others. Most of the entries are mundane: weather observations, distances traveled, supply inventories. But one page, dated August 21, 1902, contains a fragment that was preserved. Halloway says we should turn back. He won't say why. Lindstrom asked him what he saw. Halloway said nothing, but he won't look north anymore. The entry ends there. The rest of the page is destroyed. What did Halloway see on August 21, 1902? What made him want to turn back? And why, 3 days later, were the men gone and Halloway alone? These questions cannot be answered. The wilderness does not record. The dead do not testify. And Halloway, in his final moments, whispered only, "Stay quiet." Perhaps that is the answer. There are things in this world, rare but real, that should not be spoken. Not because they are false, but because they are true. Not because they are harmless, but because they are not. And some men, when they encounter these things, make the choice to carry them in silence. Thomas Garrett Halloway was such a man. He did not ask to be believed. He did not seek forgiveness. He did not explain himself. He simply endured. And in the end, that may be the most we can ask, that he kept his silence not out of cowardice or cruelty, but out of love. Love for the families who would have been broken by the truth. Love for the world, which did not need to know. The 6 men are still missing. Their bodies were never found. The Boundary Waters holds them, if it holds anything at all. The wilderness does not give up its secrets easily. And Thomas Halloway, who knew those secrets, took them to his grave. The case remains open. Officially, it will never be closed. Unofficially, it ended the day Halloway died. What happened between August 22nd and November 14th, 1902, we will never know. And perhaps, just perhaps, that is exactly as it should be.